The wind never rested in the town of Mercy's Ridge. It skirled through pine and mesquite, whispered through the crooked slats of barns, and scraped dust against the windows of those too stubborn or too weary to leave. Sheriff Elijah Keene was both. He stood at the edge of town just after dawn, hat low over his brow, eyes narrowed against the morning glare. The plains stretched east like a memory he didn't want, full of gold and ghosts. Behind him, Mercy's Ridge roused itself with the sound of creaking wagon wheels and the clink of tin cups at the saloon. The church bell hadn't rung in 2 years. The man who'd last rung it had died with a bullet in his chest and Elijah's name on his lips. The sheriff had once been a man of law and promise, known for his steady hand and the way he could talk a man down before drawing iron. That was before the fire. Before his wife, Clara, and their little boy, Joel, had gone to sleep one winter's night and never woken again. Since then he spoke less, smiled not at all. The tin star on his chest might as well have been nailed to his skin. He walked the length of Main Street with slow purpose, nodding to the blacksmith, old Zeb, who never said much, but always offered a piece of jerky from his apron pocket. Mrs. Callahan, the widow who ran the store, looked at Elijah the way some looked at graves, sad but used to them. Trouble hadn't come to Mercy's Ridge in some time, and no one missed it. Not even Elijah, who had once thrived in its clarity. These days, he chased drunks off porches and settled cattle disputes with dull, quiet words. Peace didn't suit him. It reminded him of silence, and silence reminded him of what he'd lost. That afternoon, with the sky the color of ash and a storm rolling in from the western hills, the stagecoach came late and heavy. Elijah happened to be leaning on the post by the telegraph office, chewing a stalk of bittergrass when it rolled in, wheels thick with red clay. It carried 2 passengers, sisters, the driver said, paid double not to be asked why they rode alone. The first to step down was tall, with hair the hue of dried sorrel and eyes like smoke-washed slate. She wore a man's coat over a calico dress, boots scuffed from long travel. Her chin was high, but her eyes scanned every shadow like a hunted thing. The second was younger, a slip of a girl with honey-colored curls and a limp that made each step look borrowed. She held tight to her sister's hand like it was the last rope in a storm. They gave no names, just paid for a room at the boarding house with coins scraped together from a stitched purse and a careful count of silver. Elijah watched from across the street, something in his gut going taut. He'd seen runaways before. These 2 carried no belongings, no man, and no clear destination. He didn't need a telegram from some other sheriff to guess there was a story there. But it wasn't his business, not yet. That night lightning cracked above the hills, and the wind howled like a dog shut out too long. Elijah sat in his cabin, nursing the same bottle he'd kept unopened since Clara died. He hadn't touched it in 3 years, not until that night. And yet he couldn't stop thinking of the sisters, of the bruises half hidden under the taller one's collar, the way the younger flinched from sudden sound. He'd seen fear in women before, wild, sharp, and raw, but there was something else in them, something that looked like hope trying to bloom through ash. They didn't know it yet, but Mercy's Ridge had a way of holding onto the broken. The ridge didn't ask where you came from, only whether you stayed. Elijah Keene had buried his heart in this town, but the ground never stays still forever. By the week's end, the taller sister would knock on the sheriff's door with blood on her hands and a question in her eyes. And nothing would ever be the same again. It began with chickens. On the 3rd morning after the sisters arrived, Elijah was called to the edge of town by Lyle Garrett, a farmer known more for complaints than crops. "Something ain't right out by the coop," Lyle said, waving a straw hat in the air like it was on fire. "Something bad come in the night." Elijah rode out slow, reins loose in his hand, his horse Buck taking the familiar trail past brittle cottonwoods and rust-bitten fences. The coop was torn clean open, splinters scattered like bones. A trail of blood arced off into the sagebrush, dark and sharp-smelling in the morning heat, not the work of a coyote, not clean enough for that, and too many footprints, 2 sets, bare. He followed the trail a little ways before he saw her. The tall sister stood just beyond the rise, half hidden by brush, arms slicked to the elbow in red. A rabbit lay gutted at her feet, her hands trembling around the old knife she held. Not a weapon made for killing men, but she looked like she could if she had to. Elijah said nothing at first, just watched her watch him, shoulders stiff, jaw set. "I didn't take no chickens," she said finally, voice rough as gravel. "We was hungry, that's all." He dismounted, slow and unthreatening, boots crunching dry grass. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, like it might cost her something. "May." "You got a last one." "No." He nodded, not pressing. "And the girl?" "My sister, Junie. She's 15. She's sick." "Not exactly." Me wiped her hands on the hem of her skirt. "Just ain't made for the world as it is." He could see the fatigue hanging on her like wet cloth, a woman on the edge, running on instinct and fumes, and yet still standing, still ready to fight. "You ain't in trouble," Elijah said, crouching beside the rabbit, "but you should have come to me first." She looked down at the knife. "Didn't figure you for someone who'd help." "I ain't a lot of things anymore," he said, "but I don't turn away hungry folks." She studied him like she was trying to read a map with half the letters rubbed out. Then, without a word, she turned and began walking back toward town. That night, Elijah found himself standing at the door of the boarding house, hat in hand. He knocked once. Me opened the door with a candle in her palm and shadows playing across her face. "I ain't here to chase you off," he said. "Just want to talk." Junie sat by the stove, wrapped in a quilt too big for her frame, one leg propped on a stool. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, which struck him strange. She looked at him like he was something out of a storybook she'd only half believed. Me let him in, but she didn't sit. She leaned against the far wall, arms crossed. He told them about the town, the rules, the way things worked, quietly, evenly, like he wasn't offering something more, a place to stay if they wanted it, work if they needed it, safety, though he never said the word out loud. It felt too fragile. Me listened with her eyes more than her ears. Junie asked questions. Her voice was soft and curious. She liked to draw, she said, and plants. She used to pick herbs back home, though she never said where home was. When Elijah left, Junie pressed something into his hand. A folded scrap of paper, charcoal smudged and soft at the edges. It was a sketch of his cabin, down to the wind vane on the roof and the stump out front where he split wood. He looked back once before stepping into the cold. Me still stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed in lamplight. She wasn't watching him. She was watching the dark, as if it might still come for them. The sheriff didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch with Buck tied up nearby, the drawing held loose in one hand and the other resting on the revolver in his lap. There was more to the sisters than they let on, pain that hadn't spoken yet. But for the first time in years, Elijah felt something in his chest that didn't feel like ache. It felt like the ground shifting under the frost, like something waiting to grow. The thaw came late that year. Snow lingered in the creases of the ridge like old regrets, melting slow, as if unsure it was safe to leave. He found work at the tannery, hands red with lye and leather oil, never complaining. She wore her silence like armor, but not the brittle kind. Hers was forged thick from years of watching doors and shadows. Junie, when her limp allowed, helped Mrs. Callahan at the general store, learning the till and the names of every kind of flower. She smiled more now, though it was the kind of smile that flickered, never quite settled. Elijah watched from a distance, the way he always had, though now there was something softer behind his eyes. He'd never meant to check on them as often as he did, but his boots somehow found their way past the store or down by the creek where Junie picked moss from stones. He kept telling himself it was sheriff's business. He didn't believe it much. One morning, Me came to him unasked. She knocked twice, and he opened the door with a rifle in his hands and surprise on his face. "There's a man," she said, not wasting time. "Name, Curtis Morrow. He used to own us." Elijah's knuckles went white on the stock of his rifle. Me continued, slow and low. "We weren't slaves, not in law, but he kept women like cattle, paid for some, stole others. Said Junie and me were his forever. I put a fire to his cabin the night we ran. I think he made it out." "Why tell me now?" "Because someone's been asking about us in Red Hollow. That's 2 towns over." Elijah didn't ask how she knew. He saw the truth of it in her face, in the way she stood not with fear, but readiness. "You think he's coming?" Me looked toward the ridgeline, where clouds hung low like fists. "He always said he'd find us. Said Junie had a face men'd kill for, and mine was built for taking orders." Elijah's jaw worked, but no words came. Me looked at him then, not past him, not through him, at him. "If he comes, I won't run again." He believed her, but he also knew what kind of men did what Morrow had done. They didn't scare easy, and they didn't fight fair. I'll put word out, Elijah said. If he crosses county lines, I'll know. And what'll you do then, Sheriff? He didn't answer, not yet. That week he started sleeping with his boots on and the rifle by the bed, just in case. One night Junie brought him dinner. It was stew, simple and warm, with cornbread wrapped in a faded napkin. She left it on his porch without knocking, but he saw her silhouette in the frost-fogged window, standing there a moment longer than she needed to. Inside, Elijah found a drawing tucked beneath the bowl. It was of a man and two women standing beneath a crooked tree. The women were holding hands. The man had a star on his chest. They weren't smiling, but they weren't alone. He sat with the drawing for a long while, spoon idle in his hand, the stew going cold. The first sign came 3 days later. A dead coyote hung from the church gate, throat slashed. No animal did that. Elijah buried it with a curse on his lips and a hammering in his chest. By week's end, someone had burned Me's name into the side of the boarding house. The letters were crude, seared into wood with hot iron. That night, Elijah brought the sisters to his cabin. He said it was for their safety, said the boarding house was too exposed. He didn't say how much he hated the thought of something happening to them where he couldn't see. Me didn't argue. Junie brought her sketchpad and a handful of dried wildflowers she kept in a kerchief. She placed them on Elijah's mantle like an offering. They slept in the loft, me with one eye open and Junie curled beneath the old patchwork quilt Elijah hadn't unfolded since Clara's funeral. The cabin, once silent as a grave, now held breathing. Laughter even when Junie coaxed it from her sister. It was strange. It was good. One night, me came down the ladder and found Elijah sitting at the stove, warming his hands. "Why'd you take us in?" she asked. He stared at the flames a long moment. "Because I lost everything once," he said. "Didn't think there was anything left to protect. Turns out I was wrong." Me sat across from him, close but not touching. In the quiet, something passed between them, not soft but steady. A kind of beginning that didn't ask for promises, only presence. And above them, the wind howled through the eaves, but inside it was still. The morning morrow came to Mercy's Ridge. It snowed sideways, not enough to stick, but enough to sting the eyes and blur the edges of the world. Elijah stood on the porch with his coat open and his badge cold against his chest, watching the rider emerge from the storm like a curse long spoken. Curtis Morrow was lean as a whip and twice as cruel. He wore a black duster torn at the hem and rode a chestnut mare too thin for the weight she bore. He dismounted with the casual slowness of a man unafraid. Behind his smile was something sharp, something feral. He didn't carry a wanted poster. He didn't need to. His kind left scars in place of paper. "Elijah Keene," he drawled. "Heard you, gone quiet out here. Didn't take you for a man who'd play shepherd." Elijah didn't answer, just stared, letting the silence stretch. "I'm lookin' for 2 girls, sisters. One's real sweet, other one ain't much for manners." "They're under my protection," Elijah said. "Ain't no claim you can lay here that the law'll honor." Morrow grinned, slow and slick. "Law don't mean much to me, Sheriff. I didn't come for paper. I came for what's mine." Elijah's hand rested on the butt of his pistol. "Turn around, Morrow. You've got one chance. You gonna shoot me down in broad daylight. Ain't you the law?" Elijah stepped down from the porch. His boots crunched in the snow crust. "I was the law the day I buried my family and stayed put. You think that makes me soft? It don't. It just means I ain't got much to lose." Morrow's eyes flicked, calculating. "You care about M, that it?" "I care enough." Morrow leaned forward, voice low. "Then maybe I don't need both. Maybe I just take the little one." The gun was out before the words finished leaving his mouth. Elijah didn't fire. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes stopped Morrow cold. "You touch either of them, and I'll plant you in soil so dead not even the worms'll come." Morrow didn't blink, but something behind his grin slipped. He backed up slow, mounted his horse, and turned toward the hills. "This ain't done, Keene." Elijah watched him disappear into the white. Me didn't speak for hours after Elijah told her. She just stood by the stove, hands clenched, jaw tight enough to ache. Junie sat at the table, drawing circles over and over on the same piece of paper. "He'll come back," Me said at last. "He always does." Not if I find him first, Elijah said. Me looked up, her eyes fierce. I won't hide, not anymore. I'm not asking you to, he took a breath, but if it comes to it, I'll take the shot. I want you to know that. Me nodded once, like that truth settled something in her. Then we stay. And so they did. Winter thickened. Snow came and went, clinging to the pines and burying the past inch by inch. Elijah built a second bed in the loft, stronger than the first. Me helped with the hammering, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, wood dust in her hair. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away from him either. Junie filled the cabin with drawings, of birds, of trees, of the sheriff with his rifle slung low, of me looking almost at peace. Her limp eased some, the pain less cruel in the cold months. One evening, me stood behind Elijah as he chopped wood. She watched him for a while before speaking. You ever think about marrying again? The question hit like a loose step on a staircase. He didn't stop splitting, just kept the rhythm going. No, didn't think there was much of me left worth giving. Me stepped closer. You're wrong. He turned then, slowly. She was close, close enough that the snow in her lashes caught the last of the light. There was no kiss, no embrace, just the weight of the words between them hanging warm in the cold. Later that night, Junie asked, without looking up from her drawing, Is me gonna marry you? Elijah didn't know what to say. But he looked across the room at the woman, folding blankets by the fire, her shoulders square, her scars visible in the flicker. And something inside him said yes, not yet, but yes. Morrow would come back, that was a certainty, but so was this. Elijah Keene, once hollow as an old drum, had a reason to stand and fight. And two women who'd taught him how. The wedding was quiet. No church, no preacher, no town to bear witness. Just the ridge, the wind, and three souls bound not by ceremony, but by survival. It happened in early spring, when the thaw made the ground soft, and the air held that strange mix of damp and promise. Me came to Elijah just after dawn, her hands wrapped around a chipped tin cup, steam curling from the tea she'd made. If we're staying, might as well make it right, she said. He didn't ask what she meant, he knew. They walked out past the creek, where the cottonwoods were budding and the wild thyme grew in tight green patches. Junie followed with a wildflower crown she'd made herself, fingers still stained from ink and soil. There by the stones where Elijah had once buried a locket and a letter, me placed her hand over his. No ring, no vows, just a quiet knowing, shared without spectacle. Junie said the words. Her voice trembled but didn't break. By fire and wind and the place that held us, you are joined. And that was all. They walked back to the cabin in silence, but something had changed. Me's shoulders had eased, the lines around Elijah's mouth softened. They moved not like two strangers bound by need, but like two halves learning to be whole again. That night, the stars were brighter than he'd seen them in years. 3 weeks later, Morrow returned. This time, he didn't ride alone. He brought 2 men with him, Clay and Harlan, cousins or hired blades, it didn't matter. They came at dusk, when the light plays tricks and the air grows still. Elijah saw them first, crouched by the tree line with Buck saddled and tense. Me came to his side without a word, rifle slung across her back. Junie stayed inside, her sketchpad left untouched for the first time in days. They'll come from the south, Elijah said, try to circle wide and flush us out. Me nodded, you go right, I'll cover the cabin. You sure? I didn't come this far to run again. And so they split, like old warriors with a pact. Morrow's voice echoed through the trees, syrup-thick and mocking. Sheriff, you got something belongs to me. Elijah didn't answer. He was already moving, boots muffled by pine needles, eyes sharp. The first shot rang out just as the sun dropped behind the ridge. It came from Me's side, clean and true. Harlan went down with a shout, leg crumpling beneath him. Clay returned fire, but it hit nothing but bark. Elijah found him behind the old wash barrel, crouched low and breathing hard. One shot to the shoulder and Clay dropped, screaming into the earth. That left Morrow. Elijah didn't hunt him, he waited. Morrow came as expected, slinking through the trees like a snake, gun drawn, eyes mean. They met just 10 feet apart. You think you can steal from me and call it love, Morrow hissed. Elijah's voice was low. She was never yours. Morrow raised his pistol. Me's bullet caught him in the chest. He staggered back, surprise etched on his face, as if the woman he'd hunted wasn't capable of ending him. He dropped to his knees, blood dark and quick, blooming through his coat. Me stepped forward, rifle steady. Her eyes met Elijah's. He would have killed us all. I know. Junie came running, barefoot, hair wild, tears cutting lines through dirt-smudged cheeks. She wrapped herself around me, sobbing. Elijah knelt, arms circling them both, pulling them into the warmth of his body, as if to shield them from everything that had come before and everything that might still come. They buried Morrow far from the cabin, near the place where the land gave way to scrub and shale. No marker, no words. Some ghosts don't get headstones, they get silence. That night me stood by the hearth, watching the flames flicker low. Junie slept in the loft, curled into a dreamless heap. Elijah came to her, slow and unhurried. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "You all right?" he asked. "No," she whispered, "but I'm not afraid anymore." And that was enough. They stood there, two people shaped by pain, welded by fire, and held together not by fate or chance, but by choice. The kind of choice you make every day. The kind that builds a life. Summer came like a slow breath, warm and forgiving. The hills turned gold, and the trees no longer whispered with fear but hummed with wind and life. Mercy's Ridge softened under the sun, and with it, so did those who called it home. Me no longer flinched at the slam of a door. She walked the town with her head high, apron dusted in flour from the bakery she'd started helping with, sleeves rolled and hair tied back with a strip of gingham Junie had sewn. The townsfolk, once cautious, nodded now when they passed. Even old Zeb offered her a rare smile and a slab of smoked ham, no questions asked. Elijah spent more time on his horse again, but now his rides had a different purpose. He taught Junie how to steer with the reins loose, how to read tracks in the dust, how to tell a harmless cloud from a storm. She laughed more often, that bright, sudden sound that used to feel like it didn't belong in the ridge, now settling into the air like birdsong. Some afternoons, they'd all go to the creek together. Junie would draw while Elijah and me sat knee-deep in the shallows, hands brushing by accident and not minding when they did. The silence between them had shifted. It wasn't empty anymore. It held comfort, the kind built not in words, but in every fence mended, every meal shared, every time he reached out to steady her hand as she lifted something too heavy and she let him. One evening, after the sky had turned that shade of orange that makes everything look like it's on fire, me handed Elijah a small leather pouch. Inside was a ring, not gold, just old iron worked smooth by her hands, a bit of wire twisted around it for luck. "It's not much," she said, eyes steady. "It's everything," he said. They wore no other bands, but from that day she called herself Me Keen, not because she needed his name, but because she had chosen to carry it alongside her own. And the town, in its slow, deliberate way, took it in stride. Trouble didn't vanish. Mercy's Ridge was still on the edge of things, still a place where dust settled thick and folks carried quiet wounds, but it didn't bite like it used to. One night in early autumn, a boy rode into town with a bruised face and a broken arm. Said he'd run from a ranch 3 counties west where men were worked near to death and girls went missing. Me sat with him on the porch of the sheriff's cabin, her voice low and even, asking questions that no one else had the courage to ask. Later, Elijah and me rode out together, just the two of them, and when they came back, the boy's eyes were brighter and me's hands had new scars. They didn't speak of what happened out there. They didn't have to. Junie, now 16 and bold in a quiet way, began planting a garden behind the cabin. Nothing fancy, carrots, beans, a few flowers that reminded her of places they'd never go back to. She drew a sign for it and nailed it to a fence post, Junie's hope. Elijah carved a sparrow into the wood, small and sure. That winter, the church bell rang for the first time in years. Not for a death, for a wedding. A real one this time. Miss Etta from the boarding house and her beau, a ranch hand with one good leg and a laugh like thunder. Me made the cake. Elijah stood beside them, not in uniform, but in his best coat, one Junie had mended at the elbow. Afterward, they danced in the street under strings of lanterns, and when Elijah pulled me into his arms, she didn't hesitate. Her head fit against his chest like it had always been meant to. Junie watched from the porch, smiling, her sketchbook in her lap, fingers smudged with charcoal and hope. Years later, folks would say they remembered the sheriff who used to be hollow and the sisters who rode in with nothing but each other. They'd talk about the garden behind the cabin, the laughter that returned to the ridge, the way the wind changed its song. But most wouldn't know the whole of it. They wouldn't know how grief had lived in Elijah like a second skin, or how Mee had taught herself not just to fight, but to stay. They wouldn't know the long nights, the hard talks, the slow stitching of 3 lives into something like a home. But me, Junie, and Elijah would know. And every time the wind moved through the cottonwoods, carrying the smell of earth and firewood, every time the sparrow came back to nest above the doorframe, they'd remember what it cost them to build this peace. And why it was worth everything.